Have you ever wanted to capture the aurora like this? Well, it's easier than you might think. Let me show you how it's done. First, we will take a look at the required conditions, location, weather and so on. Then I'll show you how I captured these images, so what camera settings and lens I used. And finally, we are also going to edit an image together using nothing more than Lightroom. In order to see the northern lights in the first place, the right location is vital. Northern lights are a natural display in Earth's sky, predominantly seen in high latitude regions. In Europe, the Scandinavian countries not only offer beautiful landscapes, but are also far enough up north for a proper chance of seeing the aurora. That's why a few weeks back I visited Iceland explicitly to capture the northern lights. In the winter season, the chances are higher, since we have more hours of night and capturing the aurora is only possible when it's dark outside. However, that does not mean you have to go in winter. It is possible to see the light in spring and autumn as well. I even was lucky enough to spot them in August during one of my previous Iceland trips, but of course not as strong. Another vital point we have to keep in mind is the weather. We want to have a clear night sky, as clouds will block the northern lights. It is possible to capture them with clouds in the sky if the clouds are rather thin, like in the upcoming example, or there are bigger holes where the light can shine through. But for the best outcome, we just need to pray for a clear sky. So let's assume the forecast for the night looks good. There are no clouds and we are on a location high enough up north. Are we guaranteed to see the northern lights? No. The final criteria that needs to be fulfilled is incoming solar wind from coronal mass ejections coming from the sun. If you're wondering how in the world you're supposed to know if there are solar winds blasting towards Earth, don't worry. Luckily, there are plenty of free apps forecasting solar winds and thus chances and intensity of northern lights. In this case, I'm using the Aurora Alert app, which is super easy to understand and use. Plus it's free, and the higher the KP index, the better. But don't solely rely on high numbers. The night I captured these, the KP index was hovering around 2 and I still got great images. So it's really also worth it to just look out the window and check for yourself every few hours, just to be sure. Now, what about photographing the northern lights? If possible, scout the location during the day to find the best composition. Daylight just makes it easier to find those. Plus, in this area there are a ton of other photographers, so I had to save a good spot for myself. For this shot, I placed the mountain in the back, right in the center of the frame, with the waterfall to its left and the river making this kind of bend around it. I also included a bit more of the foreground to give it some kind of natural framing. In a perfect scenario, the northern lights would have created some kind of arch right above the mountain, creating another frame element. Unfortunately, this did not happen that night, but that's okay. As I set up the shot during the day, it looked quite good with my 60mm lens. All the important elements were included, except of course the northern lights, but I quickly noticed we don't have much sky in the frame this way. And the sky is the most important element of this shot. This means just because it looks good during the day doesn't automatically make it a good setup for a different shoot during the night, especially if we want to capture northern lights in the sky. So if I would have used this 60mm lens, I would have missed most of the action. I had to use a wider lens. In this case I went with the Laowa 9mm, which because of its insanely wideness is a super niche lens, but it's great for this purpose. This does not mean you have to shoot at 9mm. It was just required for this one particular composition. For reference, here's a different composition shot on 60mm. Notice how I didn't include foreground elements, and thus 60mm was more than enough. Since we're going to be shooting in the dark, we're going to shoot a long exposure in order to capture more light. This means a tripod is of course required for sharp images. But the northern lights can move quite fast, so don't go too crazy with the long exposure. Otherwise, you might end up with a green sky without much structure. That's not what we want. In order to have more detail in the aurora, try to aim for an exposure time between 5 and 13 seconds. That's where I had the best results. Since we can't just dial up the exposure as much as we want, we need to get in more light through other ways. We can do this with a bigger aperture. In this case, I was shooting with f5.6 as that's the biggest aperture the Laowa 9mm lens has. If your wide-angle lens has a bigger aperture, that's perfect. Use it. That means you just don't have to crank up the ISO as much. That being said, I've experimented with ISO 12800 and a 6400. Both times, thanks to Lightroom's AI denoise, I didn't have much issue with image quality. But more on that later. Keep in mind, these camera settings are not fixed. Northern lights come in different intensities, so they can become super bright. Thus, with the wrong settings, you will end up with overexposure and clipping in the highlights. And we want to prevent that. So I highly suggest to always do a few test shots playing around with different settings just to be safe and don't regret it later. Also keep in mind, it's better to underexpose a little bit, as we can kind of easily recover that when editing. Clipping in the highlights, on the other hand, is pretty much impossible to fix. And in order to not miss any of the action, it's a good idea to keep shooting images. With a remote, we can automatically let the camera do the work once the camera settings are set up. Some cameras also come with an interval function that you can use to shoot images at a set interval. If you're wondering about what white balance to use, I wouldn't think too much about that because we can easily change it in Lightroom later on, as long as we're shooting in RAW, of course. And finally, also very important, if you're struggling to find the right focus point, my method is to look for a very bright star in the sky, zoom in on it and focus manually on the star. In general, keep the focus set to manual, as your camera's autofocus won't operate properly in the dark. So now that we have captured our northern light shots, let's also take a look at the editing in Lightroom. As always, you can follow along by downloading the RAW file from the link in the description of the video. So this is our RAW shot, and you can already see there is quite a bit of noise in the darkest parts of the image. That's because the ISO was quite high and the image is slightly underexposed. So before we do any of the fancy editing, what we want to do is to apply the denoise. So let's open up the details panel and simply click the denoise button. I'm not going to change anything here. I'm leaving the amount at 50. Lightroom is doing a great job at reducing the noise. You might end up with some strange looking stars in the sky. If so, you want to maybe reduce the amount, but I don't have a problem with that, to be honest. So let's click on enhance. And with the denoising out of the way, the image looks much better and we can now start with the fun stuff. Let's go open up the basic panel. I want to change the profile from Adobe Color to Adobe Standard to lessen the overall contrast and in turn get more control over it myself. Then I want to first restore the exposure. This means I'm going to bring up the exposure, making this whole shot a lot brighter, getting out more details from the darkest spots, and this will help dramatically. I'm also going to pull up the shadows for the same effect, getting out more details from the darkest parts. We can also pull up the blacks, just like this. And now looking at histogram, it looks much better. Of course, we're losing a lot of contrast due to these changes, but don't worry, we can reintroduce that later on. What I want to do next is to work on the white balance. It does look pretty good with the snow having this nice neutral white color. However, I want to stylize it a little bit. That means I'm going to bring down the temperature, making this whole shot a lot colder. And I'm also going to drastically drop the tint, which will give this whole image a greenish color cast, and this just fits for a northern light scene like this, in my opinion. So that's looking great. What I want to do as well is to bring up the texture, making this shot a lot sharper. I'm also going to introduce some clarity, which will help with the midtones contrast, and we can also play around with a little bit of dehaze to further introduce contrast. Alright, that's looking great so far. Of course, the image lacks some colors, so I'm also going to bring up the vibrance. Okay, wonderful. That's it for the basic adjustments. Let's compare to before real quick. You can see it's looking much better, although we did lose a little bit of contrast, but we are going to fix it with the upcoming masking adjustments. So let's take a look at the masking. The first thing I want to change is the sky. So let me create a sky mask. This is looking okay. There are parts of the mountain selected as well, but I don't want to change the whole sky anyway. So we can fix that by subtracting a linear gradient, and I'm just taking out a part from the bottom of the sky because I want to keep the bottom part a little bit brighter than the rest. So what I'm going to do with the upper part is I'm going to introduce contrast. I'm going to further push the contrast by increasing the highlights, and let's bring up the whites. I think right around here looks good. Now that we made the brightest parts of the sky brighter, we want to make the darker parts darker. And I'm simply doing this by pulling down the shadows. And I think we can also slightly drop the blacks. I don't want to drop the blacks too much, otherwise it starts to look very strange at some point. I just want to bring them down a very tiny bit like this. But what I want to do as well is to bring up the clarity a lot, which helps bring out structure of the northern lights. And I also want to add some texture, making the sky look sharper this way. Maybe even bring up the dehaze a notch like this. Okay, this really helps already to add more punch back to the sky. What I want to do as well is to work a little bit on the colors. That means I'm going to bring down the temperature, making the sky even colder this way. And again, I'm going to bring down the tint, make the greenish color cast stronger for the sky and for the northern lights, because I just think it looks better this way. Okay, that's it for the first mask. Let's apply a second mask. I'm going with a linear gradient, targeting the darker parts of the sky, kind of without affecting the main part of the aurora, just like that. And in here I want to further bring up the contrast, and I want to further bring down the temperature, giving this part a stronger blue tone. Wonderful. Then let me create another sky mask. This time I'm intersecting this mask with a radial gradient. That means I'm going to click on those three dots, go to intersect mask with, and choose radial gradient. I want to target the sky behind the mountain like this. And I want to make this area a little bit brighter, just to make the sky look more interesting, giving it a little more depth this way as the bottom part of the sky becomes brighter. So I'm going to bring up the exposure. I'm also going to bring up the highlights. I do think I'm going to bring up the whites as well and the blacks. And just like that, we create a really cool kind of light effect behind the mountain. I do think I'm also going to bring down the temperature, because at the moment this part has a warmer color cast and I want to make it colder. So let's drop it like this. Okay. Of course, we can also work on the landscape in the foreground. How can we do that? Simply create another sky selection. Of course, we don't want to affect the sky, so we need to invert this mask. And just like that, we get a nice selection for the foreground. There are parts selected of the sky as well. We could subtract with the brush, trying to clean up the selection. So something like this maybe. I also want to make the foreground a lot brighter. I'm going to start by increasing the whites. And since you have a lot of snow in the foreground, this will really help to add some more punch to it. We can also add a bit of contrast. And I further want to work on the color of the foreground. I do want to bring down the temperature, making it even colder. And I want to bring up the tint, because I think there is a bit too much green in the snow of the foreground. So let's raise the tint a bit, like this. Okay, maybe even bring down the saturation to make it a more purer white here. But that's looking great. Then one final mask. I want to add a radial gradient covering the waterfall on the left side like this. And I want to bring some more attention to it by increasing the exposure. Let's also increase the highlights. Let's bring up the whites. And I want to drop the temperature, since you can see there are some yellow tones in here which I don't like. So let's bring it down, giving the waterfall more of a blue color cast. That just looks better in my opinion. And let's bring down the tint. Okay, and we could make it softer by reducing the clarity and reducing the dehaze. Alright, that's looking great. That's the image after the masking adjustments. Let me turn off all the masks. That was our image after the basic adjustments. And here we have the image after we have applied some masking. You can see we did add back a lot of contrast. Now the next step is the color grading. So let's go ahead, open up the color mixer. I want to work on the hue for a moment. I simply want to pull down the aqua hue a bit, which should affect the sky in a very subtle way. Okay, let's also head into the saturation tab. I want to bring up the aqua saturation a bit. And let's also work on the luminance. Here we can make the northern lights a little more intense by bringing up the green luminance. This will make them a bit brighter. We just need to be careful to not overdo it. But I think this is looking pretty nice. I also want to bring up the aqua luminance. And let's bring up blue. Okay, looking good so far. Let's also do a bit of split toning in the color grading tab. Let's start with the highlights. And since we're working on the northern light scene, I want the highlights to have a greenish color cast. So I'm going to set up the hue in that way. Let's go with the color right around here and let's bring up the saturation. Alright, that's looking awesome. Of course we can play around with a little bit of color contrast. So for the midtones, I want to go with a cold color tone somewhere around here and let's slightly raise the saturation. Okay, nice. Then finally, let's go into the calibration tab. Here, I'm simply going to bring down the blue primary hue because I just like what this does to the image. And let's bring up the saturation a lot. Alright, that looks awesome. Now the final thing to do is the sharpening in the details tab. Let's bring down the radius, increase the details all the way up. Let's apply masking while holding down the Alt key so we can see where the sharpening will be applied. And let's bring up the amount of sharpening and we're done with the Lightroom adjustments. Now, of course, there are a ton of people around which we should clean up. I'm going to do this in Photoshop, but that's not really that interesting, I think. So that's it for editing this Aurora image. So I hope this whole video on how to shoot the northern lights was interesting and helpful. If you have questions left or if you want to add anything, as always, leave a comment and thank you so much for watching this video.